welcome to this session on building ecosystems for scaling impact initiatives. And what we're going to cover today is looking at why building ecosystem is as critical as the initiatives, programs, ventures, innovations themselves. I'll start with an anecdote. So in my last 10 years of philanthropy and impact investing experience, like many times I used to joke with my colleague that whenever the term ecosystem comes in, we're gonna, in any conversation, we're gonna have a shot, and it was more often than not, because suddenly in the last 10 years especially, it has become quite critical in the conversations, be it development finance or even in the private sector approaches. So we have quite a diverse set of panel here, and we would love to get quite a bit of wide-ranging views on how do we go about building ecosystems. So I'll start with a round of introductions for our panels, and we'll then go into some of the key themes we're going to cover today. So why don't I start with my right? Stephen, you're going to go first.
Yeah. Hello. So thrilled to be here. I'm Steve. I'm an innovator, environmentalist, and primarily a humanitarian, and I run the Geneva operational arm of Doctors Without Borders.
So, hi everybody, Bernard. I'm with the World Food Program, and I lead what's called the Global Accelerator and Ventures team, based in Munich in Germany, but like essentially we work with communities across the globe.
I'm Dominic. I lead an organization called the Transcap Initiative. We're a field builder for what we call systemic investing, which is an approach to capital deployment designed for transforming systems.
My name is Monica Sanders. I am here representing Society for Family Health in Rwanda. I'm a board member there. In my day job, I work as a business strategist at the intersection of health equity, sustainability, and market development, bringing those three together in ways that create shared value.
Patrick Walsh, co-founder and CEO of Sun King. We are a installer of affordable solar kits for off-grid homes in Africa. We've been doing that for over 20 years, and we're now installing 340,000 of those kits every month across 11 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa.
Amazing. So, as you can hear, we have quite a few different types of perspectives on the panel. We have on one side purely mission-driven but private sector-led approach, a practitioner view. We have like a large NGO and nonprofit approach here as well. Then we have from a systemic thinking approach perspective here, and then we have some human mechanism in place. So my first prompt to our speakers is, like, in your experience over your own career or running your initiative, where have you seen a small initiative turning into a big sort of ecosystem level intervention? And what worked in that particular context example? What were the challenges that faced along the way? And I would like to start with Patrick, more from, again, like, ground up, scaling a more business-oriented approach to something very complex like off-grid solar.
Thanks. I think maybe the most pertinent example I can think of, we were just discussing beforehand, is the way that an ecosystem came together to allow financing of these solar kits that we distribute across Africa. So, we design this equipment, we install it in homes, and then we provide end consumer financing so that people can actually afford to own their own solar kit over the course of about a year. And so, in doing that, at high scale, we build up a large book of receivables. We're waiting, we're putting solar kits out into the field and waiting to collect. So that requires a large amount of capital, and that working capital financing is sort of a story of an ecosystem that's been built over 15 years. It started with social venture capital, providing equity funding, Then we were able to find some debt from development finance institutions. That was dollar debt. After a while, we were able to convince commercial banks to come in. And then, we realized we needed local currency financing, not just dollar debt. So we, again, went back to development finance institutions that their, mission is to crowd in commercial capital, but we started with local currency financing in Kenya and Nigeria from development banks. And then over time, we brought in commercial banks. We've securitized those receivables and now have local currency. It's actually the largest local currency securitization across Sub-Saharan Africa in any industry is now a solar securitization, supporting the energy needs of, 50 million people who don't have access to electricity. So I think that's a story of really an ecosystem coming together and figuring out, how to support each other and build that over time.
Yeah, that's great. And we'll come to the financing aspect of it in a bit in terms of how different types of instruments and facilities are working. Maybe, Monica, if you have any examples.
Sure. This project started as a work assignment and then became a passion project. I worked with Rwanda, the Ministry of Health, and a local NGO. The vision was to move from having temporary donor-funded clinics to having permanent, sustainable primary health care clinics across the country, with the goal of having a facility within 15 to 20 minutes of every resident within the company. Within the country. This started as a pilot program and 2020 essentially, and has now moved from 20 to over 350 locations within the country. They are self-funded. They are independent and operated by nurse operators. To speak to an ecosystem perspective, we really started at the end, even before we started designing facilities. We considered everything from how do we educate tens of thousands of workers? How do we bring in tens and thousands of products and things of that nature? And how we went about that was working with each member and stakeholder and plotting through each of the steps. The long-term goal here is a move from paper-based systems to electronic systems,
right,
which accelerates pricing and things of that nature. So that's the short term. We'll get more into it.
Yeah. Thank you.
And the overall outcome is for increased or improved outcomes from a health perspective, and we now have the data to support that.
Yeah, that's a very powerful example how you went from 22 to 350 locations. Bernard, over to you. Very keen to hear from a UN perspective the kind of things you have seen that really scaled up.
Yeah, and of course, being in the UN System World Food Program, and we are active in 120 countries and territories, so that's typically where we'll be looking at working with the government, the local communities, the business to actually to determine where is hunger, what needs to be done. So there's a specificity around this which is inherent in the role, right? And just for those who don't know what the World Food Program does, whenever you hear in the news UN delivers food, it's the World Food Program. So right now we provide, for instance, in Ukraine every month food to 800,000 people, right? Maybe to just actually stay with Ukraine as one of the ecosystem examples where, years ago, and this is where also technology, innovation, and our work as accelerator comes in. We work with startups, but also internal innovations. Now, one innovation we built years ago is called Building Block, which is a blockchain-based wallet system at first. We used it in Jordan, in Bangladesh. We actually now use this in Ukraine as an identity management platform, and it's used now by 55 different agencies, so that the same family that goes to like 2 different NGOs and 1 UN entity essentially doesn't get support for the same thing twice or 3 times. And so instead, another family that didn't get support gets the support. So in Ukraine right now, 55 agencies use this, and in the last 3 years, we've been able to avoid $270 million of potentially duplicate transactions. So like essentially saving $270 million that went to additional families that were previously not receiving any assistance, right? And this, I think, and coming back to your question about like ecosystems, why is this important? Whereas like, you know, had we not started building this for World Food Program, then we, you know, explore in Jordan with also UNHCR, with UN Women. Like, so if you don't show the proof that this is actually working, I think you concur what you're saying, like, yes, you got to start, you need to show that there's value. And then, you know, if there is no value, then it won't scale. But of course, in the ecosystem, that's also an important point where, people need to be open, right? Like sometimes it's a give and take. Like the solution might not be the perfect one for you necessarily, but to be open to collaborate.
Yeah, that's very crucial. Stephen, from your perspective?
Yeah, so I didn't say who we are, but Doctors Without Borders is the largest independent medical humanitarian organization in the world, and we respond in conflict, in natural disasters, and in epidemics. And very often, though, we were in the clinics trying to treat diseases. Sometimes the treatment was toxic, like with sleeping sickness. Sometimes the treatment was unaffordable. And many times emerging diseases or pediatric formulas didn't exist. So when our organization won the Nobel Peace Prize, we took the Peace Prize and we built another organization called Drugs for Neglected Diseases. And we wanted to prove that it didn't take billions or hundreds of millions to bring a molecule to market, that it didn't need to take 20 years. And that we'd be able to do so through the partnership model, make it off source, and increasingly bring that technology to the place that it was needed most. So north-south transfer that technology. And that, it was just an idea at the beginning. We didn't even know if we could do it. But we partnered with the Malaysian government, we partnered with Osvaldo Cruz Foundation, we partnered with Ministries of Health in South Africa. And over the last 17 years, we've brought 20 molecules to market for 6 different diseases. Just one example on a malaria medication, a new malaria medication, has already been delivered to over 500 million people. The tech transferred to South Africa, the whole thing off-label and at an affordable price. And so some of the keys to that, of course, were, and some of the big stumbling blocks is to get regulatory approval for a medicine, to do the R&D, to be able to own the IP on the molecule. And so we even then reached out and partnered with Big Pharma, who had stalled development on certain molecules because for them there wasn't a market available, or they didn't think they could make a profit on it. Or we would get the approval, not the actual patent, to combine 2 molecules in order to come up with a new type of innovative therapy that would then be able to be provided, be safe, et cetera, market, and at a generic or below generic price.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a powerful example of how the market creation bit came while working in some of these contexts and drugs. Yes.
And I just have to say that we did a lot of the 3rd phase trials in MSF clinics, all under ethical standards, et cetera, because otherwise I get in trouble. Thank you.
Yeah. Dominic, you heard so many examples here of different initiatives in different sectors and contexts. Coming from systemic investing perspective and what you sort of term as capital orchestration and what Patrick also touched on, from your perspective, what sort of financing ecosystem is needed to push a lot of these interventions or pilots to really scale, and what are some of the structural barriers or challenges we are trying to address?
So I think for the cases where you have a working model that you can scale the way Patrick talked about, there are now plenty of blueprints of how to structure a facility either on purely commercial terms or blended finance terms that just need to be replicated. So there it's a question of how do you scale, how do you take all of these pilots and replicate them all around the world? And I think that's a problem that we'll probably be able to solve. When the situation is a little bit, when it's more complex, when you talk about the change of an entire system, say, an agricultural system in a particular country, and you study what needs to happen, you realize that because it's a system and because it's interdependent with other systems, there's usually a great many things that need to be financed, and these things have very different financing requirements. Some stuff is perfectly financeable with market rate transactions, and whether that's infrastructure finance or private equity or debt. For some things, you need concessional finance, but then you also need other types of finance, like de-risking mechanisms, be that insurance or advanced market commitments. You may need philanthropy. You may need a change in the tax and subsidy landscape. And all of these things need to come together somewhat in a coherent fashion. So you need a degree of strategic alignment, which then raises the question of how do you get there when the instruments that you need in the mix are controlled by very different people. And so that's where then the concept of capital orchestration comes into play. So a much more deliberate and strategic approach to coordination and to cross-sector collaboration and coordination. And we've spent a good chunk of the last sort of 18 months working with our partners to bottom out what exactly that means in practice. And one of the things to recognize is that it all depends on the context, because depending on what context you're in, be that a kind of what economic sector, what kind of country, what part of the development spectrum, the answers might be very different. Yeah. And that is one thing to sort of recognize and accept, because that sort of sits in tension with how finance operates. Finance looks for replicability, and yet every system is sort of local, and the way the Swiss agricultural system will undergo transformation will be very different from the way the Kenyan system would do that, or agriculture in the Midwest would do that. Yeah. And so we need to learn how to kind of relocalize some of these partnership models. There are certainly shared challenges and best practices that work in a universal fashion, but we need to go sort of understand context more and make sure we find models that work in specific places.
Yeah, so staying with you, I think, as you correctly point out, the context matters. Maybe the audience can benefit from a specific example on maybe the blue economy one that you can share on how you guys went about thinking through maybe the broader systems and capital orchestration piece there.
So we have a project in the, I'll tell you the story of what we're doing on regenerative agriculture in the American Midwest. That work started about 2 years ago with a pretty comprehensive mapping exercise to understand why is that system being kept in place in a very extractive, unsustainable place. Highly mechanized monocropping based on very intensive farming practices dependent on unsustainable fertilizers, etc. And we did that through the lens of money, through the lens of financial levers, and in the process sort of developed the methodology of how you make sense of leverage points within a system like agriculture when you come at this from kind of a financial perspective. And so we've taken that transitions map, as we call it, as a strategic blueprint to then build a design council of 20 organizations to design a capital orchestration platform. And so those include family offices, foundations, a couple of universities, farmer representatives, a corporation like PepsiCo. And we took them through a relatively standard design process, so divergence, convergence, and then sort of, trying to drive it to a collaboratively owned plan of action. And so what this process has said that there's 4 immediate issues that need to be resolved. One is to have what we call a strategic intelligence platform to understand current capital flows and gaps in the capital stack. Then there needs to be a matchmaking platform that connects capital with projects. There needs to be a catalytic fund to deploy capital highly strategically into underfunded areas to sort of get the whole engine up and running.
Right.
And there needs to be field building piece. Some of that comes down to storytelling, some of that comes down to technical assistance, but not only on the project side, also on the investor side. And because it's taken us a while to get there, we have now built an enormous amount of trust within that coalition that allows us to do much deeper and more meaningful work than what you'd be able to do if you just collaborated on a sort of a one-off blended finance transaction. And so we hope that starting in Q2 of this year, we can go into implementation, really build that infrastructure.
Right.
But that's going to take some time and some money as well.
Yeah, I think a number of elements you touched on there is really resonant with the approaches that's been applied in both developmental or humanitarian contexts also, in terms of scaling through catalytic capital. And maybe, Patrick, I can come to you next, and you can provide, a perspective from a scaled-up enterprise that where you saw the role of, especially we all have experience with number of donors in philanthropy. There's a huge creative tension, I call, where there's a huge amount of money that goes into the kind of right field building that is needed, which Dominic touched on. But then on the other extreme, you have the actual financing of be it nonprofits or startups. So from yours, where do you see is probably the optimum balance when it comes to scaling enterprises where you can benefit from these type of sources of capital versus them funding the entire ecosystem building piece?
In other words, what fraction of the philanthropic funds should go into building ecosystem versus direct investment?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a really hard question to answer. I don't even have a good sense myself of what that ratio is currently. So it's hard to say whether,
it will vary from sector to sector, probably. So maybe from your sector.
One thing that I think is clear is that, in terms of direct investments, we need more at both ends of the spectrum. I think Sun King managed to somehow get through its early stages, but we were really scraping by for basically a decade, and it was only because we did find a few folks willing to take risks on the company that 50 million people now have electricity who wouldn't otherwise. But then I think aside from the early stage direct investments, we're really now at a point where, we have large private equity firms involved in the business and, large amounts of debt, but we're still going to need to find liquidity for these large commercial shareholders at some point. And even now, we're looking at how can we bring more social capital into the business? Are there foundations, are there family offices that would want to own, to be on the board, because we don't want to see an organization that was built for a social mission, we don't want all the questions at the board level to be about how are we going to make money. So even though we as founders still have control of the organization, we really want to have more people at the table who are making direct investments from a social or philanthropic standpoint. Yeah, and I also think that there's so much work that still needs to be done in terms of understanding where capital can be deployed effectively. So I wouldn't shy away from doing ecosystem building work or investing in that.
Yeah. I think, Bernard, you might be in a good position to comment on that also from running venture accelerators in the food systems context. Do you have a sense obviously we are not looking for a % split, it's more like, okay, what are the types of activity that, is needed and how should a donor or philanthropy think about doing both?
I mean, I think there's advice number one, or like experience is more also like be aware of like there's different qualities. Like, so it's not just the money, it's but like also like what you deliver, right? Like, so like if you're, and this goes in lots of different ways. Like if you use like consultants that, or like you use people who work locally, or like you have international experts that live in the US, like there's actually different costs that are associated with these things, right? And like, so that's number one. Then I think I encourage, like, I think it would be commendable for, you know, funders, whether this is governments, foundations, corporates, investors, to actually like also think about the ecosystem element and like that there's actually like value out of this, right? Like, so this is not just a cost, right? And it's just too often I think the conversation goes into like, you know, specifically in the NGO or humanitarian space, you know, what's your overhead, and like, and you know, and then essentially the ecosystem becomes the overhead rather than a value driver. So let's say, in my experience as well, I think it is very hard to fundraise for that. It's also very hard to get anybody to be willing to fund this, specifically because everybody says like, well, I want my money to go to precious, like innovation startups directly in this country to benefit farmers. The ratio of money spent towards like how many people, I want to increase people's like income by 10%, like, you know, and that's often the conversation. And like, that's not a wrong conversation, right? Like, so if you having this conversation as a funder, that's great, because like you need to hold people to account. That's something that is important to do. It's just like sometimes the more professional I find, like, or experienced people have, they also then they see the value, right? And
Right.
I think but this is also where I encourage, like, maybe calling it ecosystem building is maybe not the best, but you call about like, you know, the venture support, or like the, you know, how you essentially like direct support towards ventures, which is different towards saying, well, we just do ecosystem.
Can I respond to this quickly? Sorry.
Yeah.
So I hear you. It's tactically smart. It's strategically, I think, the wrong direction, because we got to stop. Well, we just need to say, here's the work that needs to happen and that needs to be resourced, and not try and mask it as something that it's not, or you know, sell it under a different brand. Because I think, which is, by the way, my what I do on a daily basis, because I have to play that game, right? Because our work is all dependent on philanthropy money, and I have to constantly ask myself, not
Speak their language.
what is, like, you know, here's the problem and here's the solution, but I need to sort of repackage that solution in 100 different ways to make it fit the mold of philanthropy, whoever I talk to. And I think that tactically works out, because every now and then we get some money, but in the long run, it's just a losing proposition.
I mean, I think you're right, and like I think just what I started with, I think this is more like I can tell you, like, so we're running impact accelerators, and sometimes you know, we are talking to people that want to run, like, we do this because I think there's not enough impact accelerators in the space actually happening. Like, we need to do more, right? Yeah. And then I see sometimes, you know, companies coming in and essentially to do the same work that we do with like 5 people with 1, and then essentially like like, so in the reverse, right? Like they're selling like the dream, and then when I already know, well, that one person can't do the work of the other 5, right? Like, so it's more like I agree with you, and also I think like we also need to be smart in terms of when we're negotiating and like bringing people along in like the journey, right?
Yeah. Yes.
I'm going to give an example from the second generation health post. What we did, because this was an exact problem we had, what we did was we figured out what part of the ecosystem and the financing that was commercializable.
Right.
What could we sell first? And the easiest part to sell was the microfinancing for short-term capital, for cash flow.
So you use that as a hook or anchor?
That was how we got the investors on. And we agreed on what a return rate would be acceptable. Some of it was social, some of it was purely commercial.
Right.
And so from then, what we did, as I said, we worked backward. We said, what other parts of this system need to change to enable this to work? And so we worked with the government and their local distributors, and we said, hey, listen, in order for this to work, you need to give the nurse operators 90 days instead of 45 days to pay. we worked with infrastructure, and the infrastructure, overall cost of infrastructure, was partially shared by the government with the nurse operator, and so on and so forth. As you look at each part of the system, how do you change it to enable the commercial piece that makes it all work together? And that's how today we have nurse entrepreneur-operated facilities that are profitable and who now employ local folks. So you have to start. That's how we did it.
So you mean you started with that sort of commercial
Yes.
Mindset at the
Because
outset?
the whole point of this whole initiative was to move from a primarily donor-funded model to a sustainable model,
Right.
which created economic value.
Yeah,
And
so
so,
it's embedded in design. Yeah. Okay. Stephen, you want to make?
Yeah, I think we did it the other way around. Bernard and I went to Singularity at the same time and learned all about transformation and how to make an accelerator or skunkworks or whatever you want to call it. And we made ours internal. And what we did was, if ever we had a cause that was connected to something like Ebola in West Africa, and we found there were medtech pieces that were missing. But the traditional system of building medtech is going to take hundreds of millions of dollars. Yeah. And nobody's going to want it to be accessible for those who need it the most. We'll divert it once it gets to a round C to a first world or a high end in the mid world. So we built our fund the other way around. We built it internally off the use case of Ebola because there was not anything that could identify a fever. One fever from another. So you would put someone with malaria beside someone with Ebola and sentence them to death. So just like we saw that there was a gap in the medicine, we saw that there was a gap in the medtech. So we built our own internal accelerator, and with the mentality of field of dreams. Build it, they will come. And a great example of that, and it actually works both sides, because there's a business example that worked in building ready-to-use food that's treated hundreds of millions of people. But there's no incentive for that system to change. It's got a fairly, the price point is not that bad, but it's on IP, so you still have to pay for that. And there's a high relapse rate, which nobody takes into account. So we scan the world through our accelerator for bright ideas, for new ideas, and then we try to work with those people. So we found a new provider out of Bangladesh that works together with a university in the US. And they realized two things over the last 15 years. One, everybody has seen the advances in microbiome and how we know now how it affects different diseases. So they also realize how that affects the absorption of the protein that you're trying to feed to someone. And the second is the microbiome also has a big role in your immune system. Right. So what we were seeing on the relapse, there were two things. One, there was a lack of absorption, but two, a lot of these children would then get sick and then they would fall again. So now there's a new product. It's called MDT. It's a microbiome food. It does three things that are magical. One of the biggest costs in the ready-to-use food is milk. It could be 35 to 50% of the product. This takes the milk out and uses local foodstuffs, soy flour, banana flour, a mix, which are more adapted to the microbiome of the place that it comes from, and then builds up the immunity, removes the 50% of milk, could be off-label and locally manufactured, so win-win-win. But the incumbent isn't going to do that. Somebody else has to do that. And once we hopefully are successful, we've funded that through our Transformational Investment Fund. The field trials will come over the next 18 months. If we can prove that point, have folks that are manufacturing locally, have a foodstuff that's better adapted and at a lower cost, it's magic. So do it first, and then the market will follow. Each of those regional areas, somebody will want to build that plant because they've got a huge market. And so often we look at market, the idea if it could do some good somewhere is sort of in the early stage pitching, and the founders believe it and want it. But once you go through the capitalization, somebody's either going to take the idea and bury it, or they're going to take the idea and put it not necessarily where it's needed most or at the right price point.
Yeah, I think there's nuance there around what you mentioned about build it and they will come. That philosophy can work well in certain contexts that you are describing here, which makes total sense. But in a lot of other sort of contexts where we have seen, especially from both design and developmental finance, how it has evolved, for example, outcome-based financing, there it doesn't work that way. You can't just build something and expect the financing to come. So I think we are in the last segment now, where I would love for all the speakers to reflect about or think about, we are at the start of 2026. What is one thing that you would like to see happen in the ecosystem you are in, or what is one thing you might want to do differently to really scale the ecosystems that you each are operating in? So think from let's say if we ever convene again in Davos next year, what one thing would you like to see differently?
I can start.
You can start. Yes.
If you just look at macroeconomics, and then if you look at population, and then you look at rising income and education levels around the world, the biggest markets in the world for the time ahead are going to be Africa and India. Asia's already there. So in our thinking, in our financing, in our testing, in our innovating, we can build things already for that market, and there is a profitability to be had, and it can also have impact and do good. But it takes a system change, and it takes an ecosystem understanding of all those involved from the front end. And if you're a purely financial person, you can see that there's going to be a value there. It might be hard to structure it and get through those early days. I mean, when we heard your Sunway example, it was already a good idea. It's the obvious thing to do, and still, because the ecosystem around there wasn't there. And so the second thing on that is that if we all do our proselytization with family firms, with those who are in impact investing, with those who say they have patient capital, most of impact space is still trying to have market or more. And there's a disconnect between understanding that a little bit less, you're actually putting more impact. And if we could just make that slight switch, everybody can come in at their level. Doesn't matter. It's not 12 or 7. There's no judgment. But if you're trying to beat market and make impact and live on an unsustainable planet, somewhere that circle doesn't square.
Totally. Yeah.
Maybe I'll just follow it up. I completely agree. If you're trying to, check all of these boxes, it's impossible, right? Maybe I'll go with a point that might be counterintuitive. I mean, I'm a markets guy. We've built a business, essentially a purely commercial business, to try to solve a social problem. And it actually grew out of a nonprofit organization. We started as a chapter of Engineers Without Borders, and then decided to, create this business because we thought this is the only way that we can get enough capital to scale this solution. And so I truly believe in finding market-based solutions where they exist. But I think especially among this crowd, we might be overdoing it sometimes on trying to find market-based solutions. We've dabbled in the carbon markets, for instance. And, somebody asked me the question the other night, what's your viewpoint on nature as an asset class? And I didn't know how to respond to that. I was like, and I realized then he was talking about carbon, and, I'm just not so sure that that all the problems that our crowd here at Davos is trying to address with market-based solutions is addressable through a market. And we do have to look at, how can we be more influential in terms of impacting, regulatory decision-making, and trying to, just making sure that we realize not everything can be solved by building more.
Yeah, so we need both market and non-market solutions, yeah. You want to go next?
Yeah, maybe, and I think for everybody in the crowd here also, I mean, you're coming to Davos, so because you're probably want to have a positive impact in the world. I mean, some of you want to make money only, that's fine too. But maybe then you don't come to this session. I think without kidding, and even on this panel, I've been thinking, if each and every one of us is really trying to say, like, okay, like, what can we actually do together? And like even like on the energy side, right? Like, so like we're, well, you know, like we do that type of work too. Like we do like, you know, solar panels for school. You know, maybe it's not what you do, but like, so, you know, trying to actively think about like, okay, what can we actually be doing together? Or maybe everybody in the audience is like, okay, I have a friend or like somebody in my network, and like for, I don't know, make it a goal, one connection a day. I mean, like that you actually introducing for like for whatever your passion is, right? Like maybe it's like, you know, diseases, maybe it's energy, maybe it's like girls empowerment, like whatever it is, right? Like, and I think what I think coming back together next year, I think it would be great to say like, well, you know, we met here. A year later, actually based on meeting here and because of the conversation, we've had a tangible outcome that's coming from the conversation.
Right. Yeah. So you want to follow through that, you know, some of that. Dominic or Annika?
I go next. So you can go next. Okay. My wish is for philanthropy to be bolder. So if you work in philanthropy, be bolder. Yes.
This year, I'm really thinking more about the intersection of sustainability and health equity and some of the other major challenges. I see opportunities, especially now where there has been a loss of support at the global level. And I work with NGOs to help them figure out, quite honestly, what assets they have that they can monetize. And they don't think that way. And I think moving forward, working with that community, not in a capitalistic way, but they have knowledge, they have processes and things that can be adopted into other industries and other frameworks that they underestimate. And so I'm looking at it from that perspective and from this lens because I'm here to make an impact.
So yeah, sorry, I actually forgot to say something because like I mean I directed like at everybody else and you to like do something like so I'm also open to do something. So like, you know, come to me, right? Like
we'll make you accountable next year. You know what you do. That's great. On my side, also I was mentioned, at Pension for Purpose, we work a lot with different sets of asset owners, and what I really want to see in this year is some more, structural barriers addressed around fiduciary duty. So especially in the UK, we are really trying to work with a number of trustees and, both corporate and, government pension pools. And in that context, there's a even bill going into the parliament where they want to include climate risk, physical risk, part of the fiduciary duty, which is going to be a massive change, if it happens in the way you evaluate across different, across the asset classes, basically, how these institutional allocators, deploy. So you can see the contrasting perspective here from an ecosystem. Like, I'm talking about, these large institutional allocators with billions in their AUM, all the way to what Monica just shared around, like, how do you want to see on the ground action, bottom up, and what Dominic, you shared about, the philanthropy and, why we need more sort of activism there. Super. Yeah, with that, I think I'd love to, give our panelists a round of applause for their contributions. We have quite a diverse view. Thank you.